Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from, and what time has found you? 7 Secrets. Hidden across Lovecraft's mythos isn't just a title, it's a warning. These aren't surface-level curiosities or clever Easter eggs. They are cracks in the foundation of reality. Scattered across Lovecraft's stories are ideas not meant to be joined, names not meant to be spoken together, and patterns that grow darker the more clearly they come into view. Some are buried in language, others in history. A few are hidden in plain sight, camouflaged as metaphor, misunderstood as fiction. But once seen, they cannot be unseen. These secrets were never explained because they were never meant to be fully known. And yet, Lovecraft left them there, like fragments of a dream remembered only when something stirs it back to life. His world isn't a single mythology. It's a labyrinth of partial truths, each one revealing a deeper, more disturbing absence. Tonight we follow the threads across time, across texts, across thought itself. Not to solve a mystery, but to understand why the act of uncovering these connections changes us. This will not be a journey of resolution. It is one of recognition. We begin with where these secrets came from, and why their origins may be more disturbing than their consequences. H.P. Lovecraft began shaping his mythos in the early 20th century, between roughly 1917 and 1937, during a period when science was dismantling older certainties. Darwin had displaced human centrality. Einstein had weakened absolute space and time. Lovecraft absorbed these shocks deeply. His letters show a writer convinced that the universe operated without purpose or concern for human survival. This matters because the mythos did not arise from a love of monsters, but from a conviction that reality itself was hostile to meaning. His stories emerge from that belief. They are not warnings about invasion, but records of disillusion. This reveals something profound. The terror begins before any creature appears. Lovecraft's cultural inheritance sharpened this outlook. New England history surrounded him with evidence of collapse. Abandoned farms, decaying ports, failed utopian experiments. These were not symbols he invented. They were visible facts. At the same time, 19th century philosophy had already challenged divine order. Schopenhauer, materialist science, and early psychology all suggested limits to human understanding. Lovecraft combined these strands into a single posture of doubt. Consider this carefully. His horror does not argue against religion alone. It questions whether any framework can survive contact with scale. Compared to Gothic writers like Poe, Lovecraft removes moral consequence entirely. Fear comes from comprehension, not guilt. Language becomes his primary hiding place. Names such as Cthulhu or Azathoth are often treated as exotic decoration, but their function is structural. Lovecraft builds words that resist pronunciation, memory, and translation. This is not flourish, but strategy. The invented names behave like broken tools. They fail when used. The same applies to book titles like Necronomicon, supposedly written in the 8th century by Abdul al-Hazred. The text is always cited, never shown. It speaks of cycles, of alignments, of thresholds. Not as a manual, but as an absence where clarity should be, meaning collapses under naming. This approach draws from older traditions. Medieval grimoires, Gnostic gospels, and alchemical texts often promised revelation while withholding coherence. Lovecraft understood this pattern. He adapts it for a modern audience trained to trust documents. His false scholarship, dates, translators, libraries, creates authority without substance. We must pause here. The horror is not that forbidden knowledge exists, but that it cannot stabilize into usable truth. Compared to real occult texts, which aim at mastery, Lovecraft's books guarantee failure. They expose the reader's dependence on systems that no longer function when confronted with scale. Narrative structure reinforces this concealment. Lovecraft fragments information across stories, letters, and secondhand reports. No single narrator understands what they describe. This is deliberate. The mythos is cumulative, but never complete. A reader assembles patterns only by reading too much. Is this accidental, or an experiment in how belief forms? The answer matters less than the effect. Knowledge becomes distributed, unstable, and socially transmitted. The mythos behaves like a rumor that gains power through repetition rather than proof. This method anticipates later shared universes, but with a critical difference. Coherence is always postponed. Collaboration extends this design. Lovecraft encouraged friends to reuse his names and texts, knowing they would alter them. Clark Ashton Smith emphasized decay. Robert Bloch leaned towards psychological fracture. August Derleth later imposed order, adding moral structure where none existed. The secret here is preservation through distortion. The mythos survives because it resists final form. It is not a closed system, but a porous one. That porosity allows error, reinterpretation, and misuse. Each keeps the structure alive by preventing closure. These origins establish a pattern that governs everything that follows. The mythos is built from historical anxiety, philosophical doubt, linguistic failure, and intentional incompleteness. What appears as chaos is carefully arranged uncertainty. In the next section, we examine how these foundations evolve into a worldview, one where insignificance, madness, and forbidden knowledge become unavoidable consequences rather than themes. Cosmic horror did not emerge in a vacuum. Lovecraft's work arises from a long lineage of cultural and philosophical traditions that challenge human centrality. Chief among them is Gnosticism, a belief system that treated the visible world as a flawed creation, ruled by ignorant or malevolent forces. In Gnostic texts, salvation comes not through faith, but through hidden knowledge, gnosis, that reveals the true, alien nature of reality. Lovecraft inverts this structure. His secrets do not liberate, they undo. The resemblance, however, is unmistakable. Both systems describe a universe governed by forces beyond human comprehension, with knowledge as the agent of disillusion. The difference lies in outcome. Gnosticism seeks transcendence, while Lovecraft offers only collapse. Theosophy and occult revival movements of the late 19th century also shaped the backdrop. Helena Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine proposed hidden histories, ancient races, and cosmic hierarchies, all wrapped in cryptic language. Lovecraft likely encountered these ideas secondhand, through cultural osmosis, if not direct reading. He rejected their optimism, but absorbed their form. Ancient civilizations, forgotten texts, buried truths, these motifs populate his mythos. But where theosophy promised ascent, Lovecraft substituted indifference. This contrast is revealing. It is not the content of esotericism he adopts, but its architecture, the layered secrecy, the mystical geography, the sense that meaning lies just beyond the veil, only to dissolve when approached. Scientific paradigms were equally influential. Darwin's theory of evolution displaced divine design with blind adaptation. Nietzsche's declaration of God's death removed moral scaffolding, and Einstein's relativity fractured Newtonian certainty. These shifts left early 20th century intellectuals confronting a world stripped of fixed points. Lovecraft's fiction metabolizes that anxiety. His cosmos does not break rules. It has no rules that privilege us. This is crucial. While Gothic fiction mourned a lost spiritual order, Lovecraft posits that no such order ever existed. His is a realism of extinction, not death, but disappearance into irrelevance. Horror here is not the intrusion of the supernatural, but the realization that the natural is already terrifying. Dunsany, Chambers, and Poe provided more direct literary inheritance. Lord Dunsany's dreamlike pantheons suggested myth as a self-contained system, independent of belief. Robert W. Chambers' The King in Yellow introduced the motif of a text so disturbing it distorts reality. Lovecraft combined these influences with the psychological fragility found in Poe. From Dunsany, he learned tone. From Chambers, he learned structure. From Poe, he inherited the architecture of dread. The fusion is not pastiche, it is method. Lovecraft does not imitate, he repurposes. He identifies what each tradition leaves unsaid and builds outward from that silence. What binds these antecedents is their preoccupation with epistemic instability, the sense that knowledge is incomplete, misleading, or harmful. In this, they form a collective pretext for Lovecraft's own myth-making. But he radicalizes their implications. Where earlier traditions suggest veiled truths waiting to be uncovered, Lovecraft suggests that the veil is all there is. This inversion is key. It recasts the quest for knowledge from heroic to self-destructive. Not because the truth is forbidden, but because it is meaningless. His is a universe where patterns exist without purpose, and where secrets reveal not hidden order, but its absence. This inversion has deep philosophical resonance. Consider the ancient Greek concept of apatheia, the Stoic acceptance of a world beyond personal control. Lovecraft's horror exceeds even this. It is not peace with indifference. It is confrontation with hostility that doesn't even recognize us. His universe is not malevolent, but worse, it is indifferent to the point of being incompatible with meaning. In this context, the human mind becomes a failed instrument. Thought recoils from what it discovers, are not punished for our curiosity. We are simply unfit to bear its results. These intellectual and cultural threads converge in Lovecraft's work as an evolving philosophy masked in fiction. He borrows the shapes of myth, the tone of scripture, the structure of occult knowledge, but drains them of redemption. In doing so, he builds a literary architecture designed not to support belief, but to dismantle it. This scaffolding supports the mythos not as narrative, but as worldview. And in the next section, we will examine how language becomes the first tool of concealment, how names, symbols, and invented words bury secrets too volatile to name directly. Language, in Lovecraft's mythos, is not a neutral medium. It is a barrier, a symptom, and a wound. Words do not clarify, they collapse. What appears as exotic naming or mythological flourish is in fact a deliberate method of concealment. Take the name Cthulhu. Its phonetics defy consistent pronunciation. Lovecraft himself admitted it was only a crude approximation of an alien sound. This is not an affectation. It encodes a larger truth, that the thing itself exists outside human categories. The name functions not as identification, but as failure. To speak it is to misname it, to participate in distortion. In this way, language becomes the first casualty of cosmic contact. This extends beyond individual names to entire vocabularies. Lovecraft constructs an arsenal of terms: Azathoth, Shub-Niggurath, Rillier, Yog-Sothoth, each one marked by linguistic dissonance. There is no clear etymology, no linguistic root to decode. Instead, the words float unmoored from tradition, suggesting pre-human origins. Compare this with religious or mythological nomenclature, where names typically signal role, lineage, or domain. Lovecraft's names signify only alienness. They are voids in the structure of meaning. Their presence destabilizes, not enriches, the reader's understanding. The more often they appear, the less clear they become. This inversion, recognition that leads to confusion, is a consistent device in the mythos. Invented languages deepen this effect. Relayahian, Aklo, and other fragments of fictional tongues appear sporadically across Lovecraft's work. They are never fully translated. Their syntax is unknown. Their meanings are unstable. This is not due to narrative incompleteness, but by design. These languages do not exist to be learned. They serve instead to signal a cognitive boundary, a threshold beyond which thought itself unravels. In this sense, Lovecraft mimics ancient grimoires and mystical alphabets, which gesture toward knowledge while denying access. His scriptural fragments mirror occult systems, not in content, but in opacity. They frustrate rather than inform, replicating the disorientation they describe. The Necronomicon exemplifies this logic. Supposedly written by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred in the 8th century, the text appears repeatedly across Lovecraft's stories. Yet it is never quoted in full, never analyzed systematically, never shown in detail. Its authority comes from absence. We are told of its pages, its dangers, its translations, but never its contents. This is not a narrative flaw. It is the point. The Necronomicon is not a book in the usual sense. It is a symbol of collapsed knowledge, of writing that injures instead of clarifying. It promises illumination and delivers ruin. In this way, it joins a long tradition of books that should not be read. Symbolic language appears throughout the mythos in less obvious ways as well. Descriptions of non-Euclidean geometry, impossible angles, and alien hieroglyphs serve to destabilize perception. These are not decorative details. They are metaphors for epistemic breach. Geometry becomes a language that does not conform. Architecture becomes a kind of writing that defies the body. In stories like The Call of Cthulhu and The Nameless City, we encounter spaces that cannot be mapped. These spaces speak, but what they say cannot be held in the mind. This suggests a world in which the built environment participates in concealment, where even matter conspires to hide its origins. We must pause here. Lovecraft's symbolic strategy reveals something critical about the nature of secrecy in his work. It is not that knowledge is kept from us by external gatekeepers. It is that our tools, language, logic, perspective, are intrinsically insufficient. Secrecy is not imposed. It is built into the structure of understanding. The mythos shows us a reality that will not yield to our frameworks, no matter how rigorously we apply them. Even when we think we've deciphered something, an artifact, a name, a prophecy, we have only rearranged its obscurity. This linguistic architecture lays the foundation for Lovecraft's broader narrative method. Secrecy is not located in any one word or symbol. It is systemic, distributed, and recursive. In the next section, we will see how this structure extends to plot itself, how myth-building in the mythos relies on fragment, misdirection, and mimicry of historical record to create the illusion of coherence while quietly dissolving it beneath our feet. Lovecraft did not invent myth, he mimicked it. What sets his mythos apart is how precisely it imitates the texture of historical belief. Ancient lore, unreliable chronicles, forgotten names, all appear in his work not as pastiche, but as architectural scaffolding. He wrote myth as if excavating it. This approach is not merely literary, it is structural. By embedding fragments of false history into academic-sounding prose, Lovecraft blurred the line between fiction and documentation. His stories often present themselves as recovered manuscripts, eyewitness accounts, or scholarly digests. This narrative posture produces a disquieting effect. We begin not with imagination, but with plausibility. This strategy draws from romantic antiquarianism and pseudo-historical fiction. Writers like Walter Scott and James McPherson crafted myths that imitated lost traditions, often inserting invented documents into real history. Lovecraft intensifies this method. He places fictional grimoires, Necronomicon, Unaussprechlichen Kulten, De Vermis Mysteries, within real institutions, such as Harvard's Widener Library or the British Museum. This gesture is not a joke. It simulates verifiable truth. By mingling fabricated texts with real geography, Lovecraft uses spatial familiarity to stabilize narrative unreliability. Readers recognize the place, and so begin to trust the lie. What follows is not belief, but suspended disbelief weaponized. The mythos evolves through omission. No single story contains a complete theology. Instead, meaning accrues by accumulation. One tale references a name, another elaborates a ritual, a third contradicts the first. Over time, a vague system emerges, never stable, never full. This technique mirrors oral tradition more than literary canon. Consider the Iliad or the Eddas, which preserve myth through layered accounts and regional variation. Lovecraft's scattered references work the same way. They suggest a source too vast to summarize. The horror lies in this vastness. Myth becomes mythos only when no narrator can hold the whole. His collaborators accelerated this effect. Writers like Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard reused his terms, often misinterpreting them in the process. August Derleth formalized the mythos, adding elemental correspondences and cosmic dualism that Lovecraft never endorsed. Yet even this distortion added depth. The errors themselves became sediment. With each reuse, the mythos drifted further from authorial control and closer to what real mythologies undergo: reinterpretation, regional divergence, doctrinal corruption. This, paradoxically, made it more believable. Myth that cannot evolve dies. Lovecraft's secret was not control, but release. A key component in sustaining this illusion is Lovecraft's use of scholarly mimicry. Footnotes, citations, and invented sources appear throughout his fiction. These details do not clarify, they accumulate. Their function is not to explain, but to imply that explanation exists somewhere else. This is the same technique used in religious texts and mystical commentaries, where understanding is always deferred to the initiate, the priest, the scholar. Lovecraft adapts this model to horror. The horror deepens not when something is revealed, but when we are told that what we've seen is only the surface. The Necronomicon is never opened fully because it must always promise more than it gives. We must ask then what this structure implies. Lovecraft's myth-building is not about content, but method. It teaches the reader how to mistrust coherence. By imitating the slow accumulation of belief, the mythos becomes its own hoax. But this hoax is not meant to deceive. It is meant to disturb. It offers a simulation of historical weight with nothing beneath it. No redemption, no moral arc, no metaphysical certainty, just pattern without purpose. In the sections ahead, we shift from structure to substance. Having established how these secrets are encoded, Through language, tradition, and form, we now turn to the terrifying ideas they carry: cosmic insignificance, inevitable decay, and the collapse of human understanding. These are not themes introduced later. They are embedded from the start, waiting to be assembled by those who read too closely. The foundation of Lovecraft's horror is not monsters or madness. It is insignificance. The mythos returns obsessively to the idea that humanity is not central to the universe, but peripheral. In The Call of Cthulhu, the narrator famously writes, "We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity." This line is often quoted, but its implications are rarely pursued. It does not merely express humility. It suggests that knowledge is dangerous because it reveals how little we matter. The threat is not annihilation, but irrelevance. In cosmic horror, insignificance is not an emotional reaction. It is a metaphysical condition. This vision contradicts centuries of philosophical tradition. From Plato to Kant, Western thought emphasized reason, autonomy, and moral agency. Even when facing chaos, earlier literature affirmed meaning, whether divine, tragic, or redemptive. Lovecraft offers no such anchor. His universe is one in which consciousness is a biochemical accident, and morality is a local delusion. The mythos does not mourn this loss. It treats it as fact. Characters who seek knowledge discover that the universe is not hostile to humans. It is simply unaware of them. This inversion reorients horror itself. It is no longer about fear of death, but fear that life has no scale. Entropy, not evil, drives Lovecraft's cosmos. The mythos resists teleology. There is no ultimate goal, no climactic judgment. Instead, we find slow decay, recursive collapse, and things too vast to finish unfolding. In the shadow out of time, time becomes circular and fragmented. Ancient beings transfer minds across aeons, yet even they vanish. The horror is not their power, but their impermanence. Even gods are swallowed by time. Consider this carefully. When permanence itself dissolves, what can belief attach to? Lovecraft strips away the possibility of cosmic narrative. What remains is process, cold, directionless, and blind to witness. Dreams play a contradictory role. On one hand, they grant access to deeper dimensions of reality. On the other, they dissolve the boundary between perception and delusion. In The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, Randolph Carter journeys through a dreamland more coherent than waking life, only to learn that desire itself is a trap. The more he seeks the hidden city, the more it recedes. This is not simply surrealism. It expresses a terrifying possibility that what we call reality may itself be a dream, layered, recursive, and impervious to proof. In the mythos, to wake up is not to escape the nightmare. It is to enter one without shape. We must pause here. The mythos is often misread as a mythology of monsters. In truth, it is a mythology of collapse, of frameworks, perspectives, and categories that fail under pressure. Horror emerges not from violence, but from conceptual failure. The moment the protagonist understands the truth is often the moment they cease to function. In The Whisperer in Darkness, the narrator writes, "I now believe all that the doomed professor wrote, yet I wish I did not." That wish is the core of Lovecraft's project. Not to terrify, but to confront. Knowledge is not the goal, it is the threat. This thematic structure has consequences beyond narrative. It mirrors modern anxieties about information, scale, and agency. In an era of climate collapse, digital surveillance, and algorithmic control, Lovecraft's vision feels less speculative than diagnostic. His characters are overwhelmed not by fate, but by data. They uncover patterns, connections, revelations, and each makes the world less livable. This anticipates the psychological burden of systems too large to comprehend. The mythos becomes a metaphor for living under abstraction, knowing just enough to realize that knowing will not save you. What Lovecraft offers is not nihilism, but exposure. His horror lies in the realization that human frameworks, moral, perceptual, linguistic, are parochial accidents. They do not bind the real. They merely interpret a fraction of it, badly. As we move deeper into the mythos, we encounter the entities that embody this truth. The Old Ones, the dreamland gods, and the faceless forces of entropy. They are not villains. They are revelations. Their presence forces a new question. What happens when the human is no longer the unit of meaning? In the next section, we explore these beings not as characters, but as concepts, as personifications of what lies beyond comprehension. The entities of the mythos are often referred to as gods, but this term is misleading. It imposes a theological framework that the mythos actively rejects. These beings are not moral, symbolic, or purposeful. They do not represent archetypes or natural forces in the way mythological deities do. Rather, they personify cosmic conditions, chaos, entropy, alien scale. Azathoth, for example, is described as a blind idiot god who sits at the center of all reality, mindless and seething. This is not a deity in any recognizably spiritual sense. Azathoth is the mythos' stand-in for the indifferent origin of existence. It is creation without intention, matter in motion without mind. Yog-Sothoth represents a different principle, referred to as the key and the gate. It transcends linear time. In the Dunwich horror, it impregnates a mortal, a woman through occult ritual, producing a semi-human offspring who speaks in riddles and references unseen dimensions. Yog-Sothoth is not malevolent. It is proximity to knowledge itself. It perceives all moments simultaneously, rendering human causality irrelevant. As a concept, it embodies the idea that understanding the universe requires abandoning our sense of sequence, self, and spatial coherence. In this, it mirrors the structure of Lovecraft's own stories: fragmentary, recursive, nonlinear. The deity is not a plot device, but an epistemological dislocation. Nyarlathotep is perhaps the most distinct. Unlike the other outer gods, he has personality, motive, and method. He walks among humans, often disguised, spreading madness. But his role is not simply to deceive. Nyarlathotep functions as an interface between the incomprehensible and the human. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath and other tales, he is the one who communicates, who interprets, who delivers. He is the translator of cosmic horror. This makes him uniquely dangerous. His very intelligibility becomes a weapon. When the unknowable takes form, it misleads. When it speaks, it lies. In modern terms, Nyarlathotep is the symbol of seductive misinformation, familiarity masking destruction. Not all entities in the mythos are gods. Some inhabit the dreamlands, an alternate dimension accessible through sleep, but governed by its own logic. Creatures like the moon beasts or the night gaunts serve no cosmic purpose, but enforce the dream realm's estrangement. They neither help nor hinder. They exist, and that existence is enough to destabilize the dreamer. This suggests that horror, in Lovecraft's world, is not measured by hostility, but by opacity. The more we encounter, the less we understand. Even benign-seeming figures, like the Zoogs or Cats of Ulthar, reveal a world with its own internal laws, unknowable and absolute. Crucially, these beings are not metaphors. They are not symbols for human fears or desires. They do not reflect psychological states. Rather, they produce them. Lovecraft reverses the traditional horror dynamic. The monsters do not mirror our anxieties. Our anxieties are symptoms of their presence. In the Call of Cthulhu, cults and visions arise not because Cthulhu threatens, but because his mere existence exerts pressure on the unconscious. The old ones warp reality simply by being real. This is a fundamental departure from earlier horror traditions, where evil usually enters the world through corruption or summoning. In Lovecraft's cosmos, horror is ambient. We must pause here. The entities are not characters. They do not change, seek, or resolve. They are ontological ruptures, interruptions in the narrative of human order. They appear not to challenge humanity, but to erase the premise that humanity matters. Each is a reminder that personhood is a local phenomenon, that thought, structure, and culture are provisional adaptations, not universal, constants. To encounter one of these beings is to encounter the scale of our own irrelevance, rendered conscious. In the next section, we trace how human minds attempt and fail to engage with these entities. The result is madness, not because the mind is weak, but because it is functioning correctly in the wrong domain. The mythos does not punish curiosity. It reveals that curiosity, when applied to cosmic reality, is a self-destroying impulse. In Lovecraft's mythos, madness is not an aberration. It is a consequence. Human minds, built for limited scales and stable categories, cannot remain intact when exposed to the true structure of reality. This idea recurs obsessively across the mythos. Those who see too much, read too deeply, or hear what should remain silent do not lose their minds, they exceed them. In the Call of Cthulhu, Inspector Legrasse uncovers a global cult worshipping a sleeping god. He returns shaken, not because he was attacked, but because the implications of what he found never leave him. Knowledge is not neutral. It alters the framework by which thought operates. This shift from psychological instability to epistemological rupture is central. Earlier horror traditions often treated madness as a metaphor for guilt, repression, or supernatural possession. Lovecraft discards all of that. Madness in his universe is a rational response to irrational conditions. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, the narrator ends by embracing his transformation, not as a curse, but as an adaptation. This is not a descent into chaos. It is a change in species-level alignment. The line between madness and evolution blurs. The horror lies not in losing reason, but in realizing it was never suited to the world to begin with. Madness spreads through transmission. It is passed in fragments, words in forbidden books, patterns in old carvings, phrases repeated in dreams. These mechanisms appear across multiple stories: the Whisperer in Darkness, the Dunwich Horror, the Dreams in the Witch House. Each narrative introduces a character exposed to some artifact or phenomenon that exceeds ordinary explanation. What unites these episodes is the idea of contagion. Madness is not isolated. It is communicable. The human mind becomes an open system, one that leaks under pressure. Once destabilized, it becomes a vector. Ideas infect. Texts mutate. Thought itself becomes unsafe. This turns traditional storytelling inside out. Protagonists are not heroes who act upon the world. They are recorders of collapse. Their narratives are structured around what they cannot prevent, cannot explain, and ultimately cannot survive. Consider the narrator of Dagon, who writes feverishly of what he saw before taking his own life. His account is not a warning. It is residue, a message written not to be understood, but to mark the point where comprehension failed. This narrative posture, first-person testimony from the brink, pervades the mythos. It simulates the process of breakdown. The reader becomes complicit simply by witnessing. We must pause here. Madness in Lovecraft's mythos is not random, nor is it reducible to mental illness. It is thematic. It represents the failure of structure under ontological pressure. Characters do not go mad because they are weak, but because they are accurate. They have perceived something the mind cannot translate into sustained selfhood. This reverses conventional values. Sanity becomes not clarity, but insulation. Those who remain sane do so only by refusing to look too closely. In this sense, madness is a form of truth, unbearable but correct. This dynamic has modern resonance. In an age overwhelmed by information, algorithmic complexity, and inhuman systems, the mythos model of madness feels increasingly familiar. We speak of burnout, overload, derealization, not as fringe experiences, but as symptoms of ordinary life. Lovecraft anticipated this shift. His characters drown not in fantasy, but in scale. They are not destroyed by monsters. They are destroyed by patterns too large to hold. This is not allegory. It is diagnosis. Next, we examine the role of knowledge itself, not as enlightenment, but as a force that accelerates collapse. The mythos makes clear that understanding is neither linear nor safe. It is recursive, corrupting, and irreversible. The final horror is not what we learn, but that we cannot unlearn it. Lovecraft's mythos revolves around a single, inescapable paradox. Knowledge does not enlighten, it dissolves. The pursuit of forbidden knowledge, a trope rooted in Promethean myth and Faustian legend, finds no triumph here. In cosmic horror, it leads not to power, but to collapse. The Necronomicon is not a sourcebook for arcane mastery. It is a viral artifact, cited often but never read in full. This omission is not narrative coyness. It is thematic necessity. The book symbolizes a deeper reality, that the more we attempt to understand, the more fragile our understanding becomes. Knowledge in the mythos is a destabilizing force. This reversal is crucial. In most literary traditions, forbidden knowledge is guarded because it is dangerous to others. In Lovecraft, it is dangerous to the self. The act of learning becomes corrosive. In the Dunwich Horror, reading the correct texts allows the protagonists to banish a cosmic entity, but the cost is not victory, it's exposure. Armitage and his companions survive, but are visibly damaged. The final lines warn of what they've glimpsed, not what they've defeated. This pattern recurs. Temporary survival is not triumph, but reprieve. Knowledge may offer tools, but it never offers clarity without consequence. This leads to a deeper principle, epistemic collapse. The term describes what happens when a worldview fails to accommodate new data. In Lovecraft, this failure is not rare, it is inevitable. The mythos constructs a world in which the human cognitive model is outdated. Every sacred text, scientific law, or intuitive principle is slowly invalidated. Time, identity, and geometry cease to behave. In The Color Out of Space, a meteorite contaminates a farm with a force that defies classification. Scientists try to analyze it. Their instruments fail. No answers emerge, only metaphors stretched until they snap. The horror is not the object. It is the breakdown of the systems meant to explain it. Even language itself decays under the weight of knowledge. In The Call of Cthulhu, multiple narrators piece together newspaper clippings, journal entries, dream accounts, and archaeological fragments. The result is not understanding, but recursion. Every new detail forces reinterpretation of the last. The closer one gets to the truth, the less coherent it becomes. This is not a bug in the mythos. It is its logic. Information loops, contradicts, and erodes. The structure of the story mimics the collapse of cognition. The reader, like the narrator, becomes trapped in a spiral without resolution. We must pause here. The mythos reveals that knowledge cannot be separated from its effects. This is not mere cautionary storytelling. It is philosophical provocation. In Lovecraft's universe, knowledge is not neutral. It reshapes the knower. Each revelation alters not just what we believe, but what we are capable of believing. Once the veil lifts, there is no reveiling. There is only survival within the wreckage. Consider the final passage of The Shadow Out of Time, where the narrator returns from an encounter with the great race of Yith. He finds evidence of what he already suspects, that his consciousness was displaced through time. The horror is not the event. It is the confirmation. Proof completes the collapse. This concept resonates beyond fiction. In modern philosophy and media theory, epistemic instability has become central. Thinkers like Eugene Thacker argue that horror emerges from the unthinkable, the moment when thought confronts its own limits. The mythos anticipates this. It portrays a world where knowledge is not a ladder, but a trap. Each step forward removes another rung from the past. The subject is left suspended, aware but unsupported. As we transition into the literary history of the mythos, we will see how these ideas first took form, not in abstract theory, but in specific texts. Stories like The Nameless City and The Whisperer in Darkness do not describe knowledge abstractly. They show it breaking people, fragmenting memory, and dissolving time. The next section begins our analysis of how Lovecraft embedded collapse into narrative structure, and how the earliest tales quietly rehearse the doom that later stories would make explicit. The mythos did not arrive as a complete structure. It emerged slowly, pieced together across stories that hint more than explain. Early works like Dagon, 1917, The Nameless City, 1921, and The Statement of Randolph Carter, 1919, form the bedrock, not because they lay out a system, but because they introduce a method: concealment, fragmentation, implication. In Dagon, a traumatized narrator recounts encountering a monstrous being rising from the sea. The creature is barely described, and the story ends with suicide. Yet this minimalism is deliberate. The horror lies not in what is seen, but in what can never be integrated. Lovecraft establishes the key pattern: knowledge without context, trauma without resolution, memory without trust. The Nameless City extends this logic. The narrator descends into ancient ruins in the Arabian desert and finds evidence of a non-human civilization. As he travels deeper, the architecture warps, and strange inscriptions hint at a history older than humanity. At one point, he sees an impossible procession of reptilian beings in a stone corridor, but the moment passes without confirmation. The tale ends with the cryptic phrase, "The Nameless City had never known the light." The ambiguity is essential. It avoids narrative closure. The city is not explained, nor are its inhabitants. Lovecraft crafts presence without identity, existence without legibility. These early stories are bound by their narrator's limitations. First-person accounts dominate, but their function is not intimacy, it's fragmentation. In The Statement of Randolph Carter, a man describes a failed experiment in grave robbing with his friend Harley Warren, who descends into a crypt and communicates via telephone. What follows is silence, panic, and a final message: "You fool, Warren is dead." The voice is not Warren's. No explanation follows. The terror is not in the death, but in the implication that something else was speaking. Lovecraft begins here to weaponize narrative ambiguity. The reader finishes the story with more questions than the narrator, but no more information. Intertextual links begin to appear in this early period. The fictional book Necronomicon is first mentioned in The Hound, 1922, and reappears in later works. Names like Abdul al-Hazred, Arkham, and Miskatonic University begin recurring. These references accumulate. They do not clarify, they destabilize. In a traditional mythology, repetition reinforces structure. In the mythos, repetition introduces confusion. Why does the Necronomicon appear in both New England and Arabia? How does a fictional book have multiple translations and historical lineages? These questions are never answered. They are echoes, not explanations. The mythos uses recurrence to simulate depth, not to resolve it. This method parallels the formation of real folklore. Oral traditions evolve by mutation, misremembering, and layering. Lovecraft replicates this through textual transmission. A detail in one story is contradicted in another. A god described one way in 1922 is described differently in 1931. This is not inconsistency, it is mythic logic. In a letter to Clark Ashton Smith, Lovecraft wrote, "Myth is not accuracy, it is resonance." The mythos invites rereading because it resists summary. It never reveals itself directly. The earliest stories lay this foundation not by world building in the conventional sense, but by withholding coherence. The importance of these early manifestations lies in their function. They test the boundaries of narrative reliability. They establish secrecy as the central device. They introduce motifs, lost civilizations, monstrous deities, forbidden texts, not as lore, but as problems. This is a significant distinction. In later horror fiction, these elements often become tools of power or sources of revelation. In Lovecraft's early work, they are signs of malfunction. The reader cannot trust the narrator, the text, or the world. Every glimpse is partial. Every truth is contaminated by madness, translation, or loss. This strategy culminates in stories like The Call of Cthulhu, where fragmentary narratives are nested within one another, each suggesting a larger horror. But it begins here, in the unstable ground of early tales. The mythos did not emerge from a master plan. It emerged from a method of implying without stabilizing. As we move to case studies of major stories, we will see how this method is refined. Plot becomes secondary. The real structure is epistemic, a network of references that lead always to collapse. We begin with the Call of Cthulhu, not because it explains the mythos, but because it shows how explaining it is what brings the collapse. The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, is often treated as the centerpiece of Lovecraft's mythos, but its power lies not in its centrality. It lies in how it withholds central meaning. The story is framed as a dossier. The narrator, Francis Wayland Thurston, compiles notes left by his deceased uncle, Professor Angel. These notes include newspaper clippings, personal testimonies, and dream accounts, each fragment pointing to a vast, hidden reality. The structure is recursive. Each account leads to another layer, deeper and more disjointed. This is not stylistic flourish. It models the very idea the story conveys, that truth in the mythos is never singular. It is partial, nested, and corrosive. Cthulhu himself appears only briefly, and even then, indistinctly. Sailors who witness him describe a great pulpy thing with tentacles, but the physicality is vague. The focus is not on the creature's form, but on the psychological residue it leaves behind. The thing cannot be described, writes the narrator. There is no language for such abysms of shrieking and immemorial lunacy. This failure of language is key. The horror of Cthulhu is not visual, it is ontological. He exists outside of category, outside of mythological purpose. He does not punish, he does not speak, and he does not care. He simply is, a waking idea whose presence destabilizes the concept of presence itself. The global cult devoted to Cthulhu is another critical device. It appears in disparate locations: Louisiana, swamps, Arctic expeditions, Pacific islands, suggesting a pattern without causality. These worshippers do not serve Cthulhu in exchange for power. They remember him. Their rituals are fragments of something older than language, performed to sustain a god who cannot be summoned, only reawakened. This reorientation is significant. Cthulhu is not dead, but dreaming. The implication is not that he sleeps beneath the sea, but that his form of existence is waiting for conditions to align. The mythos introduces time not as progression, but as recurrence. We must pause here. The true function of Cthulhu is not to act within the story, but to reorganize the reader's sense of what stories are. In traditional horror, a monster appears, is confronted, and is often temporarily defeated. In the Call of Cthulhu, the horror has already happened and will happen again. That is not dead, which can eternal lie, the cult chants. And with strange aeons, even death may die. This is not this prophecy, it is recursion. Death is not an ending, but a phase. Cthulhu's return is inevitable, not because of fate, but because of cosmic rhythm. Myth becomes calendar. Importantly, the narrator does not encounter Cthulhu directly. He assembles fragments left by those who did. This indirectness is fundamental to Lovecraft's method. We learn about the event only through reports of those who survived it, and even they cannot interpret what they saw. One sailor, Gustav Johansen, describes angles that behave unnaturally, doors that shift shape, and spaces that bend perception. The ship's encounter with R'lyeh, Cthulhu's submerged city, is framed as physical experience, but every detail defies geometry. The horror is not that R'lyeh exists, but that its existence contradicts spatial logic. The environment itself is hostile to cognition. This narrative layering serves a philosophical purpose. It simulates the process of epistemic collapse. Each document the narrator reads brings him closer to the truth, but also erodes his trust in any framework. He begins with skepticism, ends with confession. I have looked upon all that the universe has to hold of horror, he writes, and even the skies of spring and the flowers of summer must ever afterward be poison to me. This transformation is the story's true climax. The horror does not end with Cthulhu's retreat beneath the sea. It ends with the narrator's realization that his worldview is now permanently unlivable. The Call of Cthulhu marks a turning point in the mythos. It refines the techniques of earlier stories: fragmentation, unreliable testimony, embedded texts, and unifies them into a structure where plot is merely the vehicle for philosophical dread. The reader does not witness events. They witness their interpretation, and with each new layer, certainty fades. As we turn to the Dunwich horror, we will see how this method evolves. Where Cthulhu dismantles time and scale, Dunwich will dismantle lineage, showing how secrecy, ritual, and inherited knowledge collapse the boundary between human and inhuman. The Dunwich Horror, 1928, shifts the terrain of cosmic horror from the oceanic and dreamlike to the rural and hereditary. Set in backwater Massachusetts, the story follows the rise and eventual destruction of Wilbur Whately, a being of mixed human and cosmic lineage. The horror here is not distant. It is inherited, secreted within bloodlines, family rituals, and the collapsing architecture of an isolated community. This tale introduces a more grounded, but no less destabilizing dimension of the mythos. The idea that the other is not only out there in the cosmos, but already within. What the Call of Cthulhu does through scale, the Dunwich horror does through genealogy. Wilbur is introduced as an abnormally intelligent, grotesquely aging child, born to Lavinia Whately, a deformed albino woman. His father is unnamed, except by implication. Early references to Yog-Sothoth and Wilbur's strange physical features cue the reader to his non-human heritage. His body is described in anatomical fragments: goatish legs, thick skin, abnormal growth, but it is his mind that reveals the deeper horror. Wilbur seeks the Necronomicon not to gain knowledge, but to complete a ritual begun before his birth. He is not an agent of chaos. He is its continuation, a life form functioning according to cosmically inherited logic. The story's deeper terror emerges with the revelation that Wilbur was only half of the equation. His twin, an invisible, ever-growing force, has remained hidden in the hills, whispering in an unknown tongue and deforming the landscape. This unseen being, eventually revealed as the true offspring of Yog-Sothoth, speaks to its human brother in resonant, broken English. "I am here, Wilbur. This is our time." The moment unites familial language with cosmic dread. The being is both child and apocalypse, both intimate and incomprehensible. That convergence is the story's core strategy: to render the cosmic immediate, to make the metaphysical domestic. Yog-Sothoth's nature is crucial here. Referred to as the key and the gate, he exists outside linear time, yet participates in reproduction. This duality reframes Lovecraft's horror through a metaphysical lens. Yog-Sothoth is not simply an alien being, it is process-made flesh. The gate between realms is not geographical, it is genealogical. Wilbur and his brother are not hybrids in the traditional sense. They are expressions of cosmic conditions: entropy, convergence, boundary failure, condensed into flesh. Their existence is a ritual, not a mistake. This suggests something Lovecraft rarely states outright. Horror is inherited, not chosen. Wilbur does not corrupt the world. He fulfills what has already been set in motion. The real horror lies in the ritual continuity between generations, in the idea that knowledge, like trauma, passes downward. The Whately's obsession with ancient texts and forbidden rites is not an aberration. It is a family function. The old ways, as they are often described in folklore, become cosmic imperatives. Tradition becomes transmission. This convergence of myth and heredity renders morality obsolete. The Whateleys are not evil. They are necessary conditions for a universe where thresholds are breached not by action, but by recurrence. We must pause here. The villagers of Dunwich are not heroic. They are unaware, superstitious, and ineffectual. Their fear isolates them, blinds them, and ultimately makes them complicit through neglect. Lovecraft does not demonize them, but he does implicate them. Horror is allowed to grow precisely because it is ignored. The collapse is slow, local, and obscured by familiarity. This structure mirrors real cultural decay: slow erosion masked as tradition, rituals repeated without comprehension, crises misnamed as folklore. The ending offers a superficial resolution. The invisible horror is banished by scholars from Miskatonic University, armed with the Necronomicon and a working knowledge of arcane geometry. But their victory is hollow. The entity is not destroyed, merely displaced. Its nature is revealed, its bloodline acknowledged, and its name spoken. The rupture is now known. That knowledge cannot be revoked. Like the call of Cthulhu, the Dunwich horror ends not with closure, but with a damaged epistemology. What was hidden is now recorded. The mythos expands through exposure. From here, the collaborative and posthumous expansions of the mythos will attempt to codify these patterns, sometimes deepening their ambiguity, sometimes flattening them. As we turn to those expansions, we ask, what happens when a myth built on secrecy becomes shared? How does horror persist when its structure becomes system? The next section examines how Lovecraft's peers and successors adapted, and sometimes misunderstood, his method of concealment. Following Lovecraft's death in 1937, the mythos entered a second phase, one defined not by secrecy, but by expansion. His peers and literary successors inherited a system built on implication, ambiguity, and epistemic failure. Yet, in attempting to preserve this system, many restructured it into something it was never meant to be: a pantheon, a cosmology, even a theology. This shift is most clearly embodied in the work of August Derleth, who both popularized and fundamentally reinterpreted Lovecraft's universe. Derleth's influence ensured the mythos' survival, but at a cost. He imposed order on a system designed to resist it. Derleth introduced a dualistic framework, dividing the cosmic entities into elder gods, benevolent, and great old ones, malevolent. He assigned elements, earth, air, fire, water, to deities, and cast Yog-Sothoth and Cthulhu as oppositional forces. None of this appears in Lovecraft's writing. In fact, it violates his most basic philosophical premise, that the universe is fundamentally indifferent to human categories. Derleth's revisions are not interpretations. They are overwrites. He transformed existential terror into moral conflict. Not evil, but entropy became evil. This reconfiguration made the mythos more accessible, but also less subversive. Yet Derleth's system, though reductive, unintentionally mirrors how real mythologies evolve. As oral traditions solidify into religions, fluid symbols become fixed dogmas. Lovecraft's mythos underwent the same process. Later writers expanded the universe by cataloging its entities, mapping its dimensions, and formalizing its rituals. The result is a vast, participatory body of work, but one that increasingly emphasizes taxonomy over trauma. The horror becomes collectible. Creatures once known only by suggestion now receive detailed descriptions, backstories, even genealogies. The unknowable becomes lore. Writers like Ramsey Campbell, Brian Lumley, and Lynn Carter contributed to this expanding universe, often with mixed results. Campbell retained some of Lovecraft's ambiguity, grounding cosmic forces in bleak psychological landscapes. Lumley, in contrast, turned the mythos toward pulp action. His Titus Crow novels depict humans battling Lovecraftian forces with magical technologies. This shift from dread to agency repositions the mythos as a stage for struggle rather than disintegration. The philosophical despair at its core is replaced with mythic adventure. We must pause here. This transformation reveals how easily horror yields to genre, and how secrecy dies under the weight of systemization. Not all successors compromise the original structure. Writers like Thomas Ligotti, Caitlin R. Kiernan, and Laird Barron return to Lovecraft's core idea. that the terror lies not in what is seen, but in what seeing does. Legati, for example, echoes Lovecraft's cosmic pessimism while discarding his tentacled imagery. Stories like The Last Feast of Harlequin, dread emerges from the realization that human individuality is an illusion, and that rituals exist not to connect us to power, but to erase us from its view. Kiernan's mythos fiction often avoids naming any gods at all. Her horror lies in atmosphere, geological time, and suppressed memories, Lovecraftian not in style, but in structure. The internet has played a decisive role in furthering this fragmentation. Creepypasta, alternate reality games, ARGs, and anonymous myth building have produced a new folk mythos, one where the boundary between fiction and belief is constantly destabilized. Projects like the SCP Foundation, Marble Hornets, or The Sun Vanished inherit Lovecraft's technique of documenting the unreal with bureaucratic precision. These works preserve the illusion of secrecy by flooding the reader with partial data, contradictory evidence, and inescapable loops. In this digital form, the mythos is not just read, it is inhabited. We end this section with a paradox. The mythos has survived not by staying pure, but by becoming misunderstood. Derleth preserved it by distorting it. Pulp rewritings kept it alive while gutting its core. Literary horror reclaimed its depth by stripping away its surface. And the internet, through endless mutation, returned it to what it always was, an archive of fragments. The secret Lovecraft left behind is that horror does not require coherence. It requires the illusion of proximity to meaning, almost understanding, forever just out of reach. In the next section, we trace how this illusion has crossed into the world outside fiction. Stories of sightings, hoaxes, and rituals have begun to appear in places where the mythos was never meant to take root. The question is no longer, what did Lovecraft imagine, but what happens when others believe it? The mythos has never remained confined to literature. Since Lovecraft's death, fragments of his imagined world have begun to circulate in places where fiction, belief, and paranoia blur. Urban legends, internet folklore, and occult subcultures have absorbed his creations as if they were genuine relics. Consider the Simon Necronomicon, published in 1977. Marketed as a real grimoire, it blended Lovecraftian names with Sumerian motifs, presenting itself not as fiction, but as recovered ancient wisdom. It became a bestseller. To this day, some practitioners insist on its authenticity. The point is not whether they believe, it's that belief has become structurally possible. The line between invented horror and received myth has decayed. This phenomenon echoes older dynamics in folklore. Myths, once circulated orally, evolved through misunderstanding, mistranslation, and appropriation. Lovecraft's fiction mimics that same process. His refusal to explain or resolve gave readers something dangerously incomplete. Over time, the Necronomicon, Cthulhu, and Yog-Sothoth became mimetic entities, referenced in forums, dream accounts, and fabricated sightings. On Reddit threads, YouTube deep dives, and fringe message boards, users recount dream visitations, lost books, and symbols they claim appeared spontaneously. These are not readers, they are participants. Whether ironically or sincerely, they extend the mythos beyond authorship. The fiction continues by behaving as rumor. ARGs, alternate reality games, and digital hoaxes have further accelerated this shift. In projects like Local 58 or the SCP Foundation, Lovecraftian logic, fragmented archives, hidden meanings, unstable knowledge, structures the narrative. These works don't quote Lovecraft directly. They inherit his method: oblique suggestion, institutional mimicry, recursive unreliability. The result is a storytelling form that feels real precisely because it destabilizes narrative trust. ARG creators release videos or files out of sequence. Viewers assemble meaning from ambiguity, piecing together a horror not explicitly shown. This is the mythos reborn through platform, not as content, but as structure. Music and film have also carried Lovecraft's contagion into new sensory domains. Black metal bands like Sulphur Aeon or the Great Old Ones use Lovecraftian themes to evoke scale and nihilism. Lyrics are composed in fictional languages. Album art mimics esoteric diagrams. Here, the mythos becomes ritual, less narrative, more invocation. In film, directors such as John Carpenter, The Thing, Alex Garland, Annihilation, and Robert Eggers, The Lighthouse, craft horror around perception collapse and ecological indifference. None of these explicitly mention Cthulhu, yet all orbit the same gravitational core, the fragility of human coherence. The mythos spreads not by name, but by form. We must pause here. The endurance of Lovecraft's mythos cannot be reduced to nostalgia or genre appeal. It persists because it touches something fundamental: our suspicion that the world does not answer back. The mythos reframes this silence not as absence, but as pressure, a negative theology where the divine is replaced with scale. In a world saturated with information, overwhelmed by climate threat, and marked by systems beyond comprehension, the mythos offers a mirror, not of monsters, but of mechanisms. Its creatures are not allegories. They are failures of comprehension rendered visible. Academic interest has also surged. Scholars in philosophy, media theory, and ecology have increasingly turned to Lovecraft as a source of conceptual disruption. Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet argues that Lovecraft writes from the world without us, a space beyond anthropocentric thinking. Timothy Morton's hyper-objects, things so vast they evade understanding, mirror the ontological pressure exerted by mythos entities. These readings do not treat Lovecraft as a fantasist. They treat him as a philosopher in narrative disguise. The mythos becomes a lens for confronting the unthinkable. Its utility lies not in its lore, but in its doubt. And still, something resists conclusion. The mythos cannot be pinned down because its strength lies in partial recognition. It gestures toward meaning while denying it. It builds archives that never resolve, geographies that twist, lineages that vanish into recursion. Whether encountered in a dusty bookshop, a Spotify playlist, or an anonymous digital file, the mythos remains suggestive. It offers not belief, but possibility, a space where fiction metastasizes into folklore and horror into a language we carry with us long after the reading ends. Lovecraft's creations were never designed for adaptation. Their power lies in their refusal to be visualized, named, or fully grasped. Yet across the 20th and 21st centuries, film, games, and music have repeatedly attempted to give form to the formless. This is not failure. It is transformation. Each adaptation translates cosmic horror into a new language, reshaping its ambiguity to suit a different medium. What's lost in suggestion may be regained through structure, mood, or fragmentation. These reimaginings don't preserve Lovecraft's mythos directly. They echo its function, unsettling coherence. Cinema approaches this challenge by implication, not replication. John Carpenter's The Thing, 1982, though not overtly Lovecraftian, is structured around key mythos principles: isolation, paranoia, the breakdown of identity. The alien never assumes a fixed form. Its horror is not its strength, but its incomprehensibility. The creature's biology mimics information overload. Every new form contradicts the last. Similarly, The Mist, 2007, adapted from Stephen King's novella, presents creatures that break visual logic. Tentacles appear from fog. Dimensions tear. The threat is environmental, not targeted. These films avoid direct citation. Instead, they build on Lovecraft's real legacy, epistemic disorientation. Video games offer a more immersive path. Bloodborne, 2015, fuses cosmic horror with gothic aesthetics, gradually revealing that the true enemy is knowledge itself. Players begin in a world of beasts and curses, but uncover ancient gods, alien parasites, and collapsed timelines. The deeper one explores, the more fractured reality becomes. Insight, a collectible in the game, reveals hidden entities, but also destabilizes perception. The mechanic literalizes a mythos concept. Increased awareness invites collapse. Similarly, Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, 2005, uses sanity as a gameplay element. Exposure to the mythos causes hallucinations, auditory distortions, and suicide. These games do not replicate Lovecraft's plots. They simulate his effects. Tabletop games like Arkham Horror and Eldritch Horror frame the mythos as a collaborative investigation, where players piece together clues before reality unravels. Yet even here, knowledge is double-edged. Solving mysteries accelerates the awakening of ancient beings. The Call of Cthulhu RPG, first published in 1981, remains the most faithful. Unlike most role-playing games, success is rare. Characters are fragile, sanity is finite, and the enemy is not defeat. It is comprehension. The system encourages failure, emphasizing helplessness over heroism. Players do not grow stronger, they grow more exposed. This reverses the arc of traditional storytelling and aligns precisely with Lovecraft's thematic structure. In music, the mythos reemerges through texture and invocation rather than plot. Dark ambient artists like Lustmord and Atrium Carcery craft sonic landscapes that evoke ancient cavernous spaces. Black metal bands, particularly in Scandinavia, draw on Lovecraftian themes to suggest anti-human vastness. Bands like Sulphur Aeon construct entire albums around mythos cosmology, using guttural vocals and dissonant harmonies to simulate collapse. Lyrics are often indecipherable, functioning more like incantations than messages. Here, the mythos persists as aesthetic logic, disorientation, scale, and ritual. We must pause here. These adaptations succeed not when they faithfully reproduce Lovecraft's creations, but when they replicate his philosophical damage. The mythos is not a set of characters or stories. It is a worldview. It assumes that the more we understand, the less stable the world becomes. The most effective adaptations embrace this. They use glitch, nonlinear narrative, unreliable mechanics, and sonic decay to simulate cognitive failure. The horror is not what we see. It's the realization that seeing itself is insufficient. The mythos thrives in media that can mimic fragmentation. Games allow exploration without resolution. Music bypasses language entirely. Film, when it resists explanation, becomes a portal rather than a map. These forms extend Lovecraft's project into new dimensions, often without naming him. This anonymity is not loss. It is diffusion. His horror continues not because it is quoted, but because it is reenacted. As we turn to the subcultures and academic discourses that have adopted this worldview, we will see that the mythos is no longer just a literary inheritance. It is a shared grammar for what cannot be explained. The mythos has long escaped the bounds of literature, but in subcultures and academia, it undergoes its most fascinating transformation, not into stories, but into frameworks. Across fan communities, occult circles, and scholarly discourse, Lovecraft's creations have become tools for thinking about power, collapse, and the unknown. This shift marks a deep cultural absorption. The mythos no longer belongs to fiction. It belongs to interpretation. What Lovecraft presented as fragments of a false belief system has become, for many, a metaphor for how real systems fail. Horror becomes a lens, not a genre. Fan subcultures have adopted the mythos as a coded language. Across Reddit threads, Discord servers, and blackened zines, Cthulhu and his kin appear not as monsters to be feared, but as mascots of cosmic pessimism. T-shirts bear slogans like Ia Ia, late-stage capitalism, ftang. Memes recontextualize Lovecraft's deities as expressions of climate dread or existential futility. This is not irreverence, it is adaptation. The gods become symbols of scale without solution, perfect for an era marked by inescapable systems. Lovecraft's gods are not defeated, they are endured. That posture has become culturally legible. Occult circles have also reappropriated the mythos. Chaos magicians who reject fixed belief systems in favor of symbolic experimentation have folded Lovecraftian entities into their rituals. Books like the Necronomicon files document how working with Cthulhu or Nyarlathotep has become part of some magical practices, not because practitioners believe in them literally, but because they function as conceptual devices. A ritual to Yog-Sothoth becomes a meditation on time and recursion. The boundary between fiction and belief collapses, not through credulity, but through use. The mythos offers symbols that are deliberately unstable, perfect for systems that reject orthodoxy. Academia has taken a more abstract route. Philosophers like Eugene Thacker treat Lovecraft as a writer of non-philosophy, someone who approaches metaphysical problems through negation. In Thacker's terms, the mythos articulates the world without us, a reality that exists beyond human framing. Media theorists examine Lovecraft's narrative techniques to understand how disorientation and information overload shape modern horror. Scholars of religion compare the Necronomicon to real-world apocrypha, noting how its citation without source mimics sacred texts that accumulate power through silence. These are not fan readings. They are serious attempts to understand how horror reveals the limits of cognition. This cultural saturation is not simply about adaptation, it is about function. The mythos offers a flexible set of symbols for describing what escapes human understanding: systems, ecologies, technologies. In speculative fiction, cosmic horror has become shorthand for the incomprehensible. In sociology, it parallels the experience of living inside late capitalism. In environmental humanities, it captures the dread of planetary collapse. The mythos, once anchored to pulp fiction, now floats across disciplines as a metaphor for disempowerment, scale, and unknowing. We must pause here. This is not metaphor in the literary sense. It is structural analogy, using Lovecraftian logic to map real-world experience. Ironically, this proliferation preserves Lovecraft's original strategy. The mythos was always a collaborative illusion. Its power lies not in authorial control, but in interpretive drift. Each user, reader, or theorist brings their own understanding, and in doing so, extends the mythos's lifespan. The more it is misunderstood, the more it thrives. Like a god passed between cults, it gains shape through repetition, not consistency. As we conclude, we turn inward. The final implication of the mythos lies not in text or culture, but in thought itself. What does it mean to live with the suspicion that reality cannot be known? What happens when even our frameworks for understanding horror are shown to be incomplete? The mythos is not finished. It never will be. Its true afterlife lies in the questions we are afraid to ask. The final horror of the mythos is not that monstrous gods exist. It is that we do. The deeper implication of Lovecraft's work is psychological, not mythological. Beneath the tentacles and crumbling cities lies a more unsettling realization. Human consciousness itself is a fragile construction, poorly adapted to the scale, indifference, and entropy that define the universe. The mythos lingers because it captures a specific kind of dread, the moment when explanation fails and we are left alone with cognition that no longer fits the world. The terror is not outside us. It is the realization that our models of reality were never built to last. This existential unease finds parallels in modern life. Climate change, AI proliferation, algorithmic systems, and ecological collapse are not just political or technological crises. They are epistemic ones. We know too much to feel safe, but not enough to act with certainty. Lovecraft's protagonists often occupy this same liminal space. They glimpse a truth, but cannot hold it. The most merciful thing in the world, writes the narrator of The Call of Cthulhu, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. That mercy is gone. In the age of total information, we correlate everything and understand nothing. Psychologically, the mythos has become a mirror for this condition. Anxiety, derealization, and meaning fatigue now define a significant portion of the cultural psyche. The idea that reality is fundamentally inaccessible is no longer fringe. It's felt. The mythos gives form to these emotions, not by explaining them, but by amplifying their illegibility. In The Shadow Out of Time, the narrator experiences a temporal displacement, inhabiting a non-human body in a pre-human civilization. He returns with fragments, partial memories, geological anomalies, dreams he cannot interpret. This is not metaphor. It is a model of modern cognition, fractured, overwhelmed, dislocated. Importantly, the mythos never resolves. It denies catharsis. Lovecraft's stories often end abruptly with suicide, silence, or unreadable documents. There is no closure. This is not a failure of narrative. It is a philosophical position. If the universe is indifferent, then any meaning we extract is temporary and local. This challenges more than horror convention. It disrupts the very notion of interpretive mastery. To read Lovecraft is to confront the possibility that reading itself, understanding, ordering, analyzing, is inadequate. The more we grasp, the more it slips. We must pause here. This does not mean that the mythos promotes despair. Rather, it frames horror as a kind of discipline, a practice of sitting with the unbearable. In doing so, it echoes traditions like negative theology, where the divine is defined by what it is not. The mythos trains us to think in negatives, to appreciate absence as structure. What cannot be named becomes a center. What cannot be faced becomes a perimeter. This is not hopelessness. It is precision in the face of ambiguity. The philosophical legacy of the mythos may be its most enduring aspect. It asks a question we rarely phrase so directly. What if the limits of thought are not temporary, but structural? What if madness is not malfunction, but accurate perception in a world that will not hold shape? These are not literary questions. They are cognitive ones. The mythos persists because it offers no answer, only recurrence, implication, and the permanent threat of recognition. Even now, to speak of it is to participate. Every interpretation, every act of analysis deepens the illusion that there is something to be found. But that illusion is the horror. What Lovecraft leaves us with is not revelation, but recursion. The mythos ends where it begins, with a question we cannot stop asking and cannot bear to answer.